The screaming started before Daniel Voss even made it to the back door. It was sharp, sudden, followed by a wet thud and the sound of someone yelling, "Oh my God, he's bleeding." He dropped the hose and ran across the kitchen tile, threw open the sliding glass door, and there they were. Two HOA board members standing inside his backyard. One crouched beside the flower bed holding his arm, and beside them, growling but not moving, was the reason they'd never been invited in the first place. Shadow. His rescue shepherd. Muzzled, leashed to a lead spike. Fully in his own yard, and very much defending it. The injured board member was named Scott Henley, treasurer of the Rolling Hills HOA. He wasn't just bleeding, he was furious. "Your dog bit me," he yelled, rising to his feet. What the hell kind of homeowner keeps a violent animal in a family neighborhood? Daniel didn't answer right away. He was too busy staring at the broken side gate swinging behind them. The latch had been snapped clean off. They hadn't come in through the front. They'd walked around, pried it open, and entered unannounced. "You weren't invited back here," Daniel said finally, his voice flat. "You broke in." The other board member, Karen Fields, who served as vice president, was still holding a clipboard like that somehow made it okay. "We had cause," she said. "We received complaints about unauthorized shed construction and needed to document the violation before issuing a notice. So you just broke into my yard. It's within HOA rights to inspect visible structures." Daniel pointed at the side gate. "From the street, not through my fence." The shed in question wasn't even finished. It was a simple prefab he'd been assembling for garden tools, 6 feet tall, no permanent foundation, fully within code. But this wasn't about the shed, it was about control. Karen had already made that clear 2 months earlier when Daniel declined to join the HOA landscaping committee and asked why meeting minutes hadn't been posted in 3 months. She hadn't liked the question. And now, apparently, she was answering it. With trespassing, paramedics were called, not by Daniel, but by Scott himself. He made sure to hold his arm in the air dramatically as they arrived, barking about property negligence and dangerous breeds. Daniel tried to explain that Shadow had been legally muzzled and confined to private property. The EMT didn't care. Neither did the officer who arrived 10 minutes later. He took statements, asked if Daniel had proof of the latch being broken. Daniel walked him over and showed him the splintered wood and bent hardware. "They forced it open," he said. "And the dog never left the yard." The officer nodded, took photos, said animal control would follow up as protocol. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Not because he was worried about Shadow, because he was furious about the lie he knew was coming. He didn't have a camera facing the side gate, just one at the front door. And Scott. He'd already started telling neighbors that Daniel sixed his dog on board members, as if he'd unleashed a trained attack animal, as if they were the victims. The next morning, a letter showed up in Daniel's mailbox. Not from the police, from the HOA, signed by Karen herself. It read, "Your property has been flagged for hostile and dangerous conditions. A safety review is pending, and the board reserves the right to request animal control inspection or issue removal demands for non-compliant pets." Not a warning, a threat. Daniel folded the letter once, laid it on the counter, and opened his laptop, because they might have underestimated his dog. But what did they really underestimate? Daniel Voss worked in municipal code enforcement for the county, and now he was about to bring every bit of that knowledge to war. Daniel didn't tell anyone what he was doing. Not yet. He didn't post on the neighborhood Facebook group, didn't argue in the group chat, didn't march down to the HOA office with a threat. Instead, he started pulling threads. Because Daniel Voss wasn't just a homeowner. He was a municipal code enforcement officer for the county, 10 years deep. The kind of guy who could quote setback regulations and property access laws off memory. The kind of guy who'd been in courtrooms more than once to testify on zoning disputes, fence heights and right of entry violations. And now, that expertise had a new target. He began with the HOA's own documents. He printed a fresh copy of the Rolling Hills bylaws and started highlighting everything related to inspections, enforcement, violations, and property access. Section 4.3 stated that the board could issue a visual inspection only from public-facing areas. Section 4.4 required written notice at least 48 hours in advance for any property review. Section 4.5 ? It gave no authority for forced entry under any circumstance. Karen and Scott hadn't just bent the rules, they'd shattered them. Next he pulled the gate latch from the fence and placed it in a Ziploc bag evidence. Then he contacted the fencing contractor who'd installed it 2 years prior and requested the original installation photos. Within the hour, he had proof that the gate had been fully intact just weeks earlier. He sent the photos to his personal email and backed them up in 3 locations. He wasn't being paranoid, he was being thorough. By Wednesday he'd written a 5-page complaint to the HOA board, not as a resident, but as a legal professional. It was calm, measured, filled with citations. He included photographic evidence of forced entry, a detailed summary of the bylaws the board had violated, state statutes outlining trespass and municipal liability, a summary of how Shadow had been muzzled, leashed, and confined to private property, and a final page requesting the board issue a written retraction of the dangerous dog accusation within 7 days, or he'd file a formal complaint with the HOA's insurance carrier and the city ombudsman's office. He attached the draft and closed the tab. Then he picked up the phone. The call went to voicemail. "Hi Scott. This is Daniel Voss. I understand you were injured in my yard last week. I wanted to let you know I've filed documentation with the HOA regarding your unauthorized entry, and I'll be sending a copy of that letter to your homeowner's insurance as well, since it appears your injury occurred while violating property law." He hung up. Didn't yell, didn't threaten, just logged the message in a document labeled correspondence record. The next call was to animal control. He didn't wait for them to come knocking, he invited them himself. When the officer arrived, Daniel walked her to the backyard, showed her the leash system, the muzzling protocol, the feeding schedule, everything. Shadow sat patiently the entire time, tail thumping against the ground. The officer asked one question: "Has the dog ever shown aggression before?" Daniel shook his head. "Only when someone breaks into the yard." The officer didn't laugh, but she did nod. "We won't be pursuing anything. This looks secure." He asked for that in writing. She gave it to him. Signed. Later that night, Daniel spotted Karen 2 doors down while taking Shadow for a walk. She saw him, turned, started walking the other way. He didn't call out, didn't wave, just kept walking, slowly, deliberately, past the exact house where she'd parked the day she trespassed. He made sure Shadow stayed leashed, close, and calm. But something about that image, him walking with total control, head high, no fear, seemed to rattle her more than any threat could have. Because Karen didn't know it yet, but the quiet part of the fight was already over. Daniel had everything he needed now. All that was left was to let them speak next, and watch what fell apart when they did. The next HOA meeting was held in the Ridgefield Elementary Library. It had been moved there to accommodate expected attendance, according to the email. Everyone knew what that meant. Word had spread. A dog bite, an alleged attack, a gate broken, a homeowner accused of harboring a dangerous animal, and of course behind it all, whispers that the board had entered the yard without permission. By the time Daniel arrived, the room was already filling. He took a seat in the second row, not in the back, not on the sidelines, front and center, calm, hands folded. Karen sat at the head of the folding table, clutching a manila folder like it might protect her. Scott Henley had his arm in a sling, more dramatic than necessary, but it got the reaction he wanted. A few gasps, some sympathetic murmurs. Dana, the secretary, read through the opening minutes. Then Karen leaned into the mic. "Before we begin with new business, I want to address the unfortunate incident involving one of our board members and a property within the neighborhood." She cleared her throat. "There's been a lot of confusion and misinformation circulating. Let me be clear. Board members are authorized to conduct property inspections in cases of suspected violations. This is a long-standing policy, and we acted in accordance with it." Daniel didn't flinch. Karen glanced at him, then continued. "We understand a resident's dog became aggressive, resulting in an injury to Treasurer Henley. While we regret the situation, our board acted to protect the standards of the community." Daniel raised his hand. Karen hesitated. "We'll allow public comment at the end." "You called me dangerous," Daniel said. Calm, loud enough to cut through. The room went quiet. "You sent that letter before the paramedics were even finished bandaging him." Karen stiffened. "This isn't the time." "Then I'll make it quick." He stood, pulled a folder from his messenger bag, and walked to the front. "This," he said, Placing the folder on the table is a copy of the Ridgefield HOA bylaws. Section 4.3 states that inspections must be visual and conducted from public access points. Section 4.4 requires written notice before any property access. He tapped the pages. You provided no notice, and you entered through a locked gate. That gate latch was broken. I have photos from the original installation. I also have the broken hardware in a sealed evidence bag. Scott shifted in his chair. Karen didn't move. Daniel continued. This, he said, holding up a second document, is a signed letter from County Animal Control. They reviewed the incident. They visited my property. Shadow was muzzled, leashed, and confined. He never left the yard. He turned to face the room. Your board members entered private property without permission. They trespassed. And then they tried to rewrite the story when someone got hurt. Dana spoke up. Karen, did we vote on this inspection? Karen didn't answer. Someone in the back stood up. It was Marla from Lot 12. Quiet, elderly, always kept to herself. 3 years ago I was told I couldn't plant roses near my mailbox because they weren't approved color palette. But the president at the time told me I'd have to request a hearing. That's how things used to work. More heads turned. Another neighbor stood. They fined me for a fire pit that wasn't even on. Said they saw it from the sidewalk. But now I'm hearing we're breaking into people's yards. The room was shifting. Karen could feel it. So could Daniel. This wasn't an inspection, he said. It was retaliation. Because I asked questions you didn't want to answer. Because I didn't volunteer for your committees. Because you thought no one would call you out. He turned to the board. Until now. Scott tried to speak. Something about his injury. About the trauma. But no one really heard it. Because in that moment, the room didn't care about his sling. They cared about the rules, and the fact that they'd just been told, out loud, that the people enforcing them weren't even following them. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't slam the desk. He just handed a sealed envelope to the board. Inside, a formal request for retraction, and an intent to pursue legal mediation, if the accusation of harboring a dangerous animal wasn't removed from his record. Karen didn't touch it. But Dana did. And the moment her fingers closed around the envelope, something in the room changed. The power had shifted. For real. By sunrise the next day, the whisper campaign had begun. Claire, the neighborhood newsletter editor, forwarded Daniel a message she'd received from an anonymous submission. Not all homeowners feel safe when aggressive dogs are allowed to protected property unchecked. The HOA was trying to help. What happens when next time it's a child? There was no name attached. No proof. But the timing wasn't a coincidence. The day after Daniel laid out a by-the-book takedown of the board, someone had already started crafting a counter-narrative. And it wasn't just anonymous emails. Karen posted a statement on the HOA portal by noon. Not an apology. A deflection. We understand emotions are high, following recent discussions. Please know the board's actions were always intended to serve the greater safety of the community. We urge residents to be cautious about online rumors, exaggerated claims, and media manipulation. Daniel reread the post twice, then checked the comments. A few homeowners posted supportive replies. Thank you for your service. Don't let bullies scare you. And one that simply read, his dog snapped once. It can snap again. So this was it. They weren't debating the rules anymore. They were painting him as dangerous. That evening, Daniel walked out to his mailbox and saw a pamphlet sticking out of the slot, glossy, printed. Rolling Hills Community Safety Watch. Special bulletin inside was a poorly edited letter warning about recent upticks in aggressive behavior from both animals and residents, and encouraging neighbors to report any signs of unsafe pet environments. One paragraph was bolded. Your HOA is here to protect you. If you see something, say something, before someone gets seriously hurt. It didn't name him, but it didn't have to. Daniel wasn't panicked. He was pissed. Not because he feared where it would go, but because he knew how these things usually unfolded. If you tell the truth loud enough, people will try to change the subject, and if they can't win the argument, they'll start rewriting the character of the person making it. He didn't bite, but he did prepare. First he called his county supervisor, someone he'd worked with for years. He explained the full situation, shared the letter, and the unofficial flyers, and asked one question. How much of this crosses into coordinated defamation? The supervisor didn't hesitate. The minute it hits mailboxes, it's not opinion, it's publication. That gave Daniel options. Second, he submitted a formal record request. He wanted to know who printed the safety flyer, who paid for it, whether it had been funded through HOA dues, or if it had come from a private resident. He knew Karen had friends on the board, people who might claim it was just a neighbor initiative. But Daniel had seen enough bad faith deflections to know that just was often where the damage lived. By Friday, the board called a safety review session. No open comments, no resident questions, just Karen reading a statement from behind a long folding table, while Scott sat beside her like a wounded prop. We are reviewing pet safety across Ridgefield. All homeowners with dogs over 30 pounds will receive a standard inspection notice in the coming weeks to ensure appropriate fencing, leash systems, and containment measures are in place. No vote, no discussion, just a declaration, like they were still running things. Daniel stayed quiet. He didn't speak at the meeting. He didn't interrupt the pageantry. But he was watching the room. And something had shifted. Because this time, fewer people were clapping, and more were just staring, like they were waiting for something to happen that hadn't yet occurred. Later that night, Daniel received an email from Connie, a longtime resident known more for her baking than her political views. Hey Daniel, I didn't want to say anything publicly, but I saw Karen slip a folder to the guy who printed our fall bulletin. Just thought you should know in case that matters. It did. It meant the flyer wasn't just some resident concern. It was being funded, tracked, distributed with intent. Daniel opened his laptop and began compiling screenshots of the comments, the HOA statement, the physical flyer, the new inspection proposal, his recorded conversation with the animal control officer, and most importantly, a copy of the board's own spending report, pulled from last quarter's newsletter. Page 6, showed a small but noticeable charge for community printing and distribution. Safety communication, $138.92. Karen had used HOA funds to smear a homeowner. And now, it wasn't just about a broken gate, it was about financial misconduct. And he was ready to bring the receipts. Karen didn't speak for the first 10 minutes of the next board meeting. She sat at the far end of the table, flipping through printed pages, like she was preparing for a courtroom defense. Scott sat beside her again, the sling gone this time. Just a fresh bandage and a face that looked like it had aged 10 years in a week. The room was packed, but not loud, not tense, just watching, waiting. And this time, it wasn't to hear from the board, it was to hear what they wouldn't say. Dana, the board secretary, cleared her throat and read the standard opening. Then she skipped to item 2, titled Resident Concerns Regarding Recent Safety Flyers and Property Inspections. Karen looked up for the first time. Before we begin, I'd like to clarify, those flyers were a personal outreach effort, not an official HOA document. They weren't approved by the board, and weren't paid for using community funds. Daniel didn't move. He didn't even blink, because that sentence, that was a lie, and he was about to prove it. He stood from his seat near the front and addressed the room, not the board. That's interesting, because last quarter's financial report, page 6, lists a charge for safety communication printing and distribution, line item, $138.92. A few heads turned. Karen froze. Those flyers were signed with the HOA logo, they were printed using board funds, and they were distributed with the intent of influencing public opinion about an ongoing dispute involving me, my dog, and a trespass that was already under review. He held up the newsletter, which makes it a misuse of funds. And that's no longer just unethical, that's reportable. Scott opened his mouth to say something, then thought better of it. Dana leaned forward. Karen, did you approve the flyer budget? Karen tried to smile. It didn't land. It was a discretionary expense. I thought it was necessary. But it wasn't voted on, Dana said. And it targeted a specific resident. No one spoke for a moment. Then Marla, the same quiet woman who once defended rosebushes, stood up from the fourth row. I don't care about the flyers, she said. I care that someone broke a gate, blamed the homeowner, and then tried to make him look dangerous. Someone clapped. Then someone else. And then the room broke into a slow scattered applause, not wild but certain, not angry. Just done. Karen stood abruptly. I have served this community for 4 years. I have volunteered hundreds of hours. And no one's questioning your time, Daniel said, calmly. We're questioning your accountability. She gathered her papers, barely holding the edges. If the board wants me gone, then just say it. Dana didn't hesitate. We're holding a vote. Right now. Right now. 5 board members. 3 votes to censure and suspend all of Karen's voting privileges for 90 days pending formal review. 1 abstained. Scott voted no. But even he didn't look convinced. After the vote, Karen sat down. Slowly. Like someone who just realized the room she thought she controlled no longer existed. There was no cheering. There didn't need to be. Because something else was happening now. People were remembering that the board wasn't supposed to be above them. It was supposed to represent them. The next day, Dana sent out a community-wide update. Short, clean. The board acknowledges the concerns raised regarding recent conduct. We are initiating a policy review, and will begin accepting homeowner feedback on enforcement processes and financial transparency. A third-party mediator will assist in next quarter's evaluation. No jargon, no hiding, just a message that said, "We heard you." Daniel didn't throw a party. He didn't spike the football. He took Shadow on a walk that evening, down the usual path, past the mailbox cluster, where the flyer had once been taped. It was gone now, replaced with a handmade sign taped over the bulletin board. Dogs welcome. Bullies, not so much. He chuckled. Someone had signed it. Lot 9. He didn't know who lived at Lot 9. But apparently, they knew him. Shadow still waited by the fence every morning. At 7:10. Same spot. Same rhythm. Ears perked at the sound of joggers. Eyes tracking squirrels with military precision. Tail thudding the ground like a metronome. But there were no more inspections. No warning slips. No sideways glances. Just a couple of kids riding scooters past the gate. One of them waving through the slats and shouting, "Hi doggy," as they zipped by. And for the first time in weeks, Daniel didn't feel like he had to walk out and stand watch. The storm had passed. And Shadow. He'd never needed permission to protect the yard. But now it felt like no one was trying to take that from him. Karen never returned to her board seat. After the vote to suspend her was made public, she submitted her resignation by email. No goodbye. No explanation. Just a PDF attachment labeled formal notice. Scott followed a month later, quietly, unceremoniously, after the board announced a mandatory ethics training initiative for all members. He didn't say much, but his pride wouldn't allow him to sit through a class on how not to be sued by your own neighbors. Daniel didn't run for a board seat. He didn't want the meetings or the politics. But he did show up. To vote. To speak. To listen. And when Dana asked if he'd be willing to help draft a new property access policy for enforcement reviews, he said yes. They worked on it over 3 weekends at the local library. And when the new clause passed unanimously, it came with a new name. The Shadow Rule. All inspections required. 72-hour notice. No entry onto private property without consent. Board members found violating the rule would be subject to removal. No more gray area. No more fences being crossed because someone thought they had the right. The neighborhood itself started to feel lighter. The community garden reopened. Someone started a monthly potluck again. Porch decor became a quiet rebellion. More flower boxes. More wind chimes. Even a hand-painted turtle statue in front of the lot where Karen used to live. Claire wrote a short column for the newsletter called Porch Peacekeepers, highlighting neighbors who used their front spaces for joy instead of judgment. And when someone asked if Shadow could be featured in the next issue, Daniel smiled and said sure. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt steady. There were still board meetings. Still rules. Still the occasional passive-aggressive note about garbage bins left out overnight. But the air was different now. People didn't whisper anymore. They spoke. And when they saw something they didn't like, they didn't wait to see if it would go away on its own. One evening, Daniel sat on the back patio, with Shadow curled beside him, and a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand. The gate had been repaired. Reinforced. There was a camera above it now. Not out of paranoia, but principle.
Sometimes safety was just documentation. Sometimes it was a dog with patience. Sometimes it was knowing your story, your voice, and your name carried more weight than the people who tried to silence them. And on that quiet evening, with no board members peering over the fence, no accusations echoing through inboxes, and no flyers fluttering on the bulletin board, Daniel finally let himself exhale. Shadow stretched, yawned, and leaned against his leg. "You did good, buddy," he said softly. The dog didn't react, didn't need to, because some guards don't bark when it's over. They just stay close until peace feels permanent again.